Sitting in my mother's recliner, looking out the window into the early twilight, I listened to the silence. From the window, it was not the passing cars I noticed, though ones my mother often described in detail for the past couple of years. She counted them, wondering why at times the often busy road was deserted. Instead, I noticed a tree. It was silhouetted against a backdrop of many, and light did not shine down upon it. Instead, it stood strong, engulfed in a blackness that spoke to me. And so many things had spoken to me within those 24 hours, none of which were visual. My sleep-deprived brain wondered if I should call my mother and tell her about this tree, like the times I called and told her about weather anomalies, blooming flowers, or even the strange fruit I would spy at the grocery store. And then I remembered the moments around midnight. The exhausting drive between Pulaski and Williamsport, Maryland, the feeling of my mother's cold hand in mine, her inability to focus. But that last quirky eyebrow raise she gave me as I counted down the 10 best moments I'd had with her, and I watched her mouth form the O's of several breaths, and then fade. The woman who had been the catalyst or the muse for a majority of my work that I had created since about 2015 had left. And I sat alone in her apartment, unable to process the loss, looking at her tree. And it occurred to me, though, that this was the one thing I wanted to remember from her death experience. That black tree summed it all up. I spent the evening drawing and photographing it, and it became the basis of what became this image. And at some point, this particular print it's more of a side note than it is anything else, but it's definitely the beginning of what would become a new series of work that I'm about to show you. And though I identify as a photographer, I really am in love with ink, and my time as a graduate student at Radford University has allowed me to explore several printmaking mediums. Mostly, I have dedicated myself to photogravures. This is an example of one of my photogravures. It was made in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I studied with Don Messick and his Making Art Safely studio. I've been very infatuated with this, to the point of even getting my own etching press and exposure unit. But then I had the opportunity to take a class with Rebecca Gezzi. She decided to teach screen printing, and I knew I had to give it a go. And I admit, it's been a real challenge. It seems very persnickety. Serography is affected by atmosphere issues when temperature and humidity fluctuate, and if you pull too many prints at one time, it can even be painful. When I started her class, I began at the very beginning. I found myself drawing, and as I worked through her projects, I seemed to be mostly inspired by my cats. And for the first semester, I tried to learn everything I could about the process as opposed to creating lasting works of art. But this created a source of frustration. I knew deep inside I had a vision. I just had to find it. Putting pressure on myself, I spent those months in a purgatory of not creating anything more meaningful than my rendition of Mary Shelley's cat, which you just saw. But helping build both my angst and my inspiration, I looked to some of my favorite artists, such as Daniel Danger, who created this particular piece here. I love the darkness. I love that atmosphere. But it also made me wonder if I had anything really to add to the genre of silkscreen or serography. You know, I'm no Daniel Danger, but what I am is L.S. King. And though I didn't know when I screen printed that particular black tree, a door opened, and it showed me the possibilities for incorporating photography into this medium in a way that suddenly seemed authentic, or at least to me, and like a next step forward. And that meant looking backward. How could I bring out my personal aesthetic, which tends to be dark and moody, in a graphic and sometimes colorful expression with serography? I'd always been attracted to the turn of the century, 20th century, aesthetics, especially in the form of older photographic techniques like the daguerreotypes and their shimmery appearance. This particular one holds a lot of magic for me. It's Sterling McIntyre's view of San Francisco Harbor. And then there's pictorialism, and the pictorialists with their narratives of emotion, darkness, and a certain graininess abound. You'll see that in this kind of image, which is by Alfred Stieglitz. It's also a photogravure, and it's called The Hand of Man. And then my inspiration arrived, like Stieglitz's train. I knew I could translate the silvery magic of daguerreotypes, the atmosphere of gravures, into potential blackness of serigraphy. My mother's black tree print became a catalyst, which led to an experiment with this image that you see here. I wanted to know what my photographs would look like in serigraphy form. I knew I could take my images, work with them in Photoshop, and create layers to reflect emotions and mood. And after a month of numerous trials and errors, 100 sheets of Bristol board, 1 full container of black ink and silver and other colors, not to mention the beginning of a repetitive stress injury, what began as a glimmer of hope flared into a new pathway. My next step was to finish a companion piece to the first effort. Both images were made on the first day of 2019, and they weren't just a culmination of a year that came to represent many personal losses, but instead, I saw them as a hope for something more, for a sense of peace. And when I made the photographs in my neighborhood during that last remaining hour of daylight, I didn't know they would become the true start of the Remain series. But when I look back at the year and all the photos I had made in between traveling from veterinarians, assisted living communities, hospitals, hospices, and cemeteries, I had one thought. Despite the losses, I had made images on the long drives shooting out the car window or while on short walks between parking lots and place, and I shot with whatever I had on hand, either my iPhone or my DSLR. And it didn't matter if I was in Tennessee, Alabama, Virginia, or Maryland. The image making for me was a form of meditation, and I thought maybe the photos would be part of my road diary series, but after seeing my first 2 experiments, I needed to do more serigraphy. For me, whether it's the Remains or road diaries, when I cross my fingers, take a leap of faith required for making an image while never stopping, and then editing the images, I capture places neither in the then or the now. I time traveled to a quiet in-between. And through my image-making process, it seems like time travel becomes more evident. This image shows what happens when I add grain to the image and turn it into a purely black and white image. Quite literally, there's no gray. This is done by saving the image as a bitmap so that it's comprised of nothing but tiny black dots. And then I print this out onto a transparency, which is what I use to burn into my actual silk screens. These actually show my 3 screens I used to create this print. For each, I digitally printed a transparency. I use something called Diageo Developer. I coat the screen with light-sensitive liquid, and then I let it dry, and I put the transparency onto the screen. I expose it to light, develop it with water, and then I let it dry. The far left image is the background, which I use something on that called a split fountain, which I'll explain in just a moment. And the middle screen shows the next layer, which was a screen that was done in brown for the ground. And then the last image shows the image itself, the black that's going to show forth on the final product. And with these, the yellow parts of the screen are the areas that allow the ink to go through the mesh and onto the printing surface. And this is what the final print actually looks like. Unlike many of my black and white work, which is done with a touch of sepia, for this particular series, my Remain series, the imagery seemed to beg for color, shimmering like magic seen in daguerreotypes. And through my first semester with Becky Gezi, I learned that by adding silver ink to other colors, this gives a lovely shimmer. So to pay homage to the silver and the metallics in traditional photographic processes, adding a bit of silver actually to the whole process seemed perfect. In this print of Fayetteville, Tennessee, I created a silver layer to highlight the industrial elements of the silos and other machinery. But in other images, the silver is only there in the colors mixed in, such as this one from Dublin, Virginia. The other technique that I mentioned earlier that is crucial to these images is the split font. This allows me to have color gradients and is how I create the skies and the ground. In this process, I used blue, pink, yellow, and brown lined up side by side on an open screen and made a background layer. Depending on the placement of the color and whether I blend them or keep them carefully separated, I'm able to create subtle shifts of time based on colors I tend to see during my work commute. This is what a split font looks like without the black printed on top of it, without the image. On the left you see the print pulled and getting ready to have black put on top, which is what the top screen is, and the other is several of the split fonts drying. You'll see subtle differences in all of them. By careful placement of the colors of the split font, I've been able to get the sky down to the ground with one layer. And I decided to use one color palette throughout the series to keep everything consistent, even though the seasons changed as I did the landscape throughout my travels. One of the things I thought about as I was making this series was a comment a friend made to me in regard to someone else he knew who was dealing with a parent who had dementia. He thought she obsessed about it and talked as though she were the only person in the world dealing with such issues. And as I went through this process with 2 different family members this past year who ultimately died of complications involving aging, I wondered if I too had obsessed in such a way. As I look at these images in this series, I think maybe perhaps I have obsessed, but really, I hope they aren't just about self-actualization, but something that others can take away. Something that brings a sense of tranquility to the trials we all inevitably go through. And maybe these images will help others see the places and objects that are in one's day to day. Maybe they're worth taking another look and seeing in a different light. Not everything is as it seems. And what is lost, it may exist in places in the in-between of what was and what remains. Thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. I hope you found it peaceful, and I hope that if you have any questions, you'll feel free to reach out to me through the comments, or you can reach me at my website, which is lskingphotography.com.